Most of what we've been told in many aspects of nutrition and health is complete nonsense, telling us to eat more carbohydrates, grains, vegetable or seed oils, to avoid meat, eggs, which are superfoods. They've got nearly everything wrong. You couldn't get 10, 12 heads in a row. So it can't be random stupidity from the system.
Today on Mind, Body, Health, and Politics, I have the great privilege of being able to interview Ivor Cummins, who is a world-renowned chemical engineer, a systems analyst, and philosophical theorist. I'll do a little introduction. Skepticism is a philosophy that goes back thousands of years. And basically what the skeptics are saying is you can't be certain of anything. And since you can't be certain, your best bet, if you will, is to think in terms of probabilities rather than think you know what's happening. So, for example, we can't be 100% certain that the sun is going to rise tomorrow, but there's a great probability that it will. We cannot be 100% certain that when we get on an airplane, we're going to be safe. But the statistics, the probability statements are such that most of us get on planes. You can apply this to a lot of things. Our guest today applies it to governments. You can't be absolutely certain, or maybe even relatively certain, that what governments tell us is accurate. Now we're going to talk to Ivor Cummins, who's going to tell us a lot of his thoughts on why we should be skeptical and why we should actually mistrust many of the institutions that have been set in stone. Welcome to Mind, Body, Health, and Politics, Ivor.
Thank you, Richard. Privileged to be here.
So, how did you get involved in speaking truth to power and questioning authority? Take us to a little bit of a history and then bring us up current.
Okay, I'll try and keep it reasonably brief. So I'm a biochemical engineer and I spent over 25 years in complex problem solving, all branches of science in a corporate setting, very high cost issues that had to be resolved quickly. So I led teams all over the world. I worked in management and as an individual master technologist, directly leading teams and technically engaged. So I did it all. But in 2012, I got some poor blood tests, cholesterol and a couple of other enzymes. And they were so bad that I knew, wow, this is way outside the population normal distribution. Looks significant. Doctor was a little concerned. So I did my classic role. I slipped into my role of being brought in to lead a complex problem-solving team when they're in difficulty.
Right.
And I grilled the doctor. Two key questions. What are the implications of these kinds of numbers? And what are the root causes that I would start addressing to bring them back into range? And it was quite clear the doctor wasn't really sure at all. And these were standard blood tests. So I said, well, that's weird. Maybe the doctor's an idiot. So I went to a more senior doctor and, long story short, a teaching professor of medicine after that. Same result. I mean, there were some pointers, some of them had merit, but a few days researching on ResearchGate and PubMed into these metrics, it was manifestly clear they didn't really understand their own metrics, really, on those two key questions.
Ivor, are you saying they were not able to explain why they were theoretically concerned about your high cholesterol numbers?
Exactly. There were musings about, oh yeah, these are not good, and cholesterol was very high, so heart disease, and serum ferritin was high, the iron loading in the blood.
Yes.
And maybe that could be hemochromatosis, which is an Irish disease, hyperabsorption of iron from the gut.
That's right.
But I got a test. That wasn't it. They didn't have much else to say. And then serum GGT, gamma glutamyl transferase, the liver enzyme. And
Yes.
the classic thing there is you're drinking too much, perhaps. but that wasn't the case. I fixed that metric as well in the following weeks without changing my alcohol. I kept that constant because I wanted a pure experiment, if you will. But long story short, I just realized there was some massive hole in medicine if these experts didn't know their own blood tests. I mean, it took me 1 or 2 evenings on ResearchGate and PubMed to be way ahead of them. And I said, how can that be? So I figured there must be something huge to be discovered. And I had 5 kids, and I was pretty interested in my not dying early. And the risk for high GGT, ferritin, is astonishing. The actuaries use those metrics. So it was a big deal. And again, long story short, I explored the metrics. They led me to Syndrome X from Professor Reven, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, physiology, essentially, insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia. I mean, it took me a week or 2 of obsessive studying at nights and weekends to open up insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia. And then cholesterol was high, so I got into that. And I found out most of the papers published on cholesterol, when you actually dig into them, the abstract doesn't really reflect what's in the paper. And the supplementary tables, which you could download in ResearchGate, you could dig into the data and see through the kind of bias and chicanery. So I realized the cholesterol thing was utter nonsense also.
All right,
So,
time out. 1 second, Ivor. I'm trying to wrap my head around what you were dealing with. What got their attention to begin with, if I understand you, was that your cholesterol numbers were very high, right? And you're
Yep.
saying when you went to discuss this with them, what is it that they could not explain to you about the relationship between the high cholesterol numbers, atherosclerosis, and you being at risk?
Well, at first, remember, I hadn't yet researched it in depth. So I asked basic questions, and they had a generic high cholesterol is bad, clogs your arteries. I mean, it was baby stuff. And then I went and researched it and found out that was nonsense. But at the time, I didn't know enough to grill them deeply. But it was basically surface little truisms. That's what I got on each metric. So I had to go and look. And when I looked, I found out there was an enormous amount of data, and most of what we've been told in many aspects of nutrition and health is complete nonsense, sadly. I mean, I was shocked myself. I couldn't believe it. But within a few weeks, I realized to a certainty, I mean, you know, the predictive power in science is very important. So I predicted, and I told my wife after 2 weeks, serum ferritin has to be a 6th marker for metabolic syndrome. Because, you know, you have low good cholesterol, you have hypertension, middle belly fat, and a couple more, and high blood sugar. So that's metabolic syndrome, which is type 2 diabetes, which
Yes.
is hyperinsulinemia. Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
So, yeah, so I predicted, and I said to her, serum ferritin, from everything I'm finding in the deeper science, has to be a marker. And then I came running out of my sitting room one Tuesday evening, I think, shouting, because I found a paper from Asia, actually, and its title was pretty much that serum ferritin should be the 6th marker for metabolic syndrome. Yeah. So I had all
Yes.
these insights, and I knew I had it cracked.
Well, I understand what you're saying there, and we don't want to spend too much time on it because we really want to get into your skepticism and your theories about why we shouldn't trust government. But you have my interest on this topic because it's one of it's. I mean, I have a curious mind like you, and I'm curious about that same topic. My understanding in terms of the theory is that we have these little tubes, and we call them, our vascular system, and sometimes a little microscopic tear occurs, a little tiny, like a hair sticks up, and then stuff swimming by gets stuck on the hair, and then something gets stuck on the stuff that's stuck, and over time you build up a little mound of that stuff, and that's what we call atherosclerosis, because any kind of blockage in a tube is going to impede the transmission of the fluid. That's the theory, correct? As you understand it also, right?
That's the kind of generic theory for sure, but just to be a little more accurately, the
Yeah.
most likely process that's occurring is there is damage to the wall. That's true.
Yes.
There then is local repair, and
Yes.
there's some clotting involved.
Yes.
And then endothelial progenitor cells are released and they gather around the lesion and they try and repair. But if you
Yes.
keep doing the thing that's driving the chronic inflammatory process, damaging the artery, you'll keep getting more and more clots. And cholesterol does get involved in that healing process. And ultimately, the heart attack or the stroke is when one of these lesions breaks open catastrophically, spilling its contents into the blood and causing a massive clotting event. Yeah.
Yes. Right. We understand it exactly the same way. Okay. So that got you to start questioning things. Now bring us forward. A little
Yeah.
fast
So
forward.
it kind of added previous experience. I, as an engineer, am proud of my profession. If people brought up things that you might consider sounding like conspiracy theories, I would lord it over them and dismiss them. Like I would say, like all the professors and all the experts are wrong. Yeah. And that was the way I was 20 years ago. My first awakening was the 2008 great financial crisis. You know, I had 5 kids, we had a big mortgage, I got burnt. So I spent a couple of weeks, like I did with the blood metrics, and I explored the world of macroeconomics and I found out how rotten it was. So I won't get into detail there, but it was my first big shot across the bows that all of what we're told by bankers and economists, a lot of that is nonsense or avoiding what's really happening. So there was that. But this example that threatened my future health really brought it home to me. And if we look at it, I have often said that if you flipped a coin, speaking of probabilities, the primary things we've been told on nutrition and health, they've gotten so many of them wrong and come out with a megaphone telling us to eat more carbohydrates, to eat grains, to eat vegetable or seed oils, to avoid meat, to avoid eggs, which are superfoods. They've got nearly everything wrong. You couldn't get 10, 12 heads in a row. So it can't be random stupidity from the system. It's bias. And it can be, a profit motive. It can be political. But our world is just full of massive bias from the in-groups, if you will. And nearly everything, or not nearly everything, a lot of stuff that's said in the legacy media and by politicians, I guess a lot of it's true. But on the real core things, the things of importance, they're mostly wrong, and it's not an accident.
It's not
There's
an
an
accident.
agenda.
Well, if it's not an accident, then most likely it's money, because money is what's driving so much of what's going on around the world historically and today, and you and I both know that. So then the question is, what's the agenda? What is the benefit when they come out with particular things? So, for example, in my case, I know that the fastest way to reduce anxiety is through a breathing technique. But the pharmaceutical companies are making a fortune selling benzodiazepines to help people relax. They do not want people practicing breathing because it'll ruin them. The same thing in psychedelics. If one pill of psilocybin can decrease depression measured in a year, that means no one needs to really give the pharmaceuticals an annuity of taking a pill every single day for 365 days. They can take it once. So there's a profit motive in maintaining a particular position, which is injurious to untold numbers of people, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the classic driver was pretty much key bono, and it was the profit motive. So just quickly running through, cholesterol originally, I think, was a misunderstanding from the 1930s up to the 50s and 60s. But then it became an enormous industry. And after that, no one could be allowed to wise up, because now you have one of the biggest drugs on the market, the statin class, and even injectables now, you know. So that's a classic money. And then the flip side as well, they got it right that smoking is bad for you, broadly speaking, but it took them 30 or 40 years. So the reason they couldn't get it right for 30 or 40 years was big tobacco profits, you know,
Yes.
and lobbying.
Yes.
So it worked either way, either to defend something indefensible or to promote something equally indefensible. It's always the same thing, or traditionally was. It's a profit motive. Now, things have got a little more complicated now, and especially since the whole viral issue in 2020, where I've come to learn that it's not just money. I mean, absolutely, there were mass medications that were coerced and practically mandated, and there was vast amounts of money made by the pharmaceutical industry. But I think there were bigger drivers for that. It was kind of a trigger event to open up and finally acquire global digital ID, which will be required for the upcoming central bank digital currency. So I think it's getting a lot more complicated, that the agendas now are going beyond mere profiteering.
Okay, what I'd like you to talk about now is, what do you see as the 5, let's say, biggest lies that are being told to the public? And the 5 biggest, let me clarify, the 5 biggest and most dangerous. Biggest isn't a good word. What do you think are the most dangerous lies that are being told to the public currently? And let's dissect a bit.
Yeah, now I love the way you clarified that, Richard, because yeah, there's so many, and the whole nutrition I'm going to leave aside now. There's a whole series you can catalog there. Now, in general nutrition, vilifying meat and eggs and the most wholesome Homo sapiens ancestral foods, and promoting seed oils, you know, chemical vegetable oils, and processed grains, which drive diabetes, that whole thing is huge because of the vast amounts of chronic disease, obesity, etc. So we'll put nutrition in one big ball.
The big lie of nutrition. Number one. Okay, I'm with you.
It's number one. Then when you get into, I think I interviewed Professor, what's his name, Plimer from Australia the other day in Dublin. He came to Dublin. Climate. The idea that there is a climate catastrophe, right? There are climate changes. There are shifts in climate. CO2 has very little to do with it, and there's no catastrophe. And countless professors have called this out. I see that as extremely sinister and dangerous. It's all over the legacy media, almost to the point that they're appearing idiotic to me. But there's a big agenda there to kind of deindustrialize the West and get a more managed economy and a managed population, and work against the kind of population numbers we have. Very sinister, goes to the UN, the World Economic Forum. I'd say that that's a huge lie, because our energy security, like in UK, for instance, their energy security now is risable. They've lost their steel industry on the back of this climate thing. The windmills, the solar farms, the trillions of dollars, the Inflation Reduction Act from Biden in the USA. It goes on and on. They're literally making a mess of our whole Western societal, economic, and industrial structures. And they're really important.
And you're saying these sequelae are from what's being sold to the public about the climate issue? Is that right?
Yeah, basically, it's an agenda. It was called Agenda 2021 of the UN. Now it's Agenda 2030. It's even more horrifying. But there's countless organizations like World Economic Forum, Club of Rome, I mean, even Trilateral Commission and many others. They're all behind the climate disaster agenda, because it enables essentially a form of new world government, especially in the West. and it enables many goals. Moving towards a technocratic kind of dystopia, I would kind of call it, and they're getting a lot of traction. It's scary. It's a huge lie.
Now, I want you to elaborate on a technocratic dystopia that you think they're aiming for. What does that look like?
Well, what that looks like, the simplest way I often compare it to is, if people think this is conspiracy theory, well, A, it's all documented in the UN agendas and plans. It's couched in nice language, but it's all documented. In the West, we have a free speech, unruly population of, let's say, ants. And there are huge desires all the way up the ladder to get a better managed ant farm with huge amounts of surveillance, digital IDs, central bank digital currencies, 15-minute cities. All of this is published. You know where it's going. They look with a jealous eye at China. China runs its farm very well, incredibly well managed. They've got it all sorted. So I think if that's a way of looking at it, a world in which free speech becomes largely a thing of the past, if you criticize the government or even question some of these nonsense theories like climate change, they want a world where you can't question, you can't show dissent, you can't gather in numbers, everything managed and locked down essentially in a way, and using technology.
Okay,
so hence technocracy.
And the motivation from that would be the word order, O-R-D-E-R, right? Supreme order. Everything would be regulated and orderly and homogeneous.
Absolutely. But the crucial thing is, it's not a true version of, let's say, communism. And theoretically, everything's all managed, centrally managed economy, and everyone's equal. Of course it's not. It's 1984. 2 legs good, 4 legs bad. There will, of course, be, as in all of human history, in totalitarian regimes, there are the elites, the Politburo, the upper echelons, and there are the masses. And that's the problem. If it truly was a utopia of order, well, I guess you wouldn't need censorship. You wouldn't need to suppress free speech because, hey, everyone's happy. But it ain't like that.
No, what you're talking about, and using China as an example, might be expressed as ultimate safety and security in exchange for freedom and liberty.
Yes.
Is that right?
Absolutely. And I think, was it Benjamin Franklin who made that famous quote, about security and safety versus freedom? There's no contest. And even though we have a population now that sadly, we're a few generations since World War II, and in the West since any notable hardship, people have gotten very soft, and safism is a massive problem. So I would say in the 50s, if you tried to bring in safety kind of concepts in order to take away free speech and take away all the freedoms we have, it wouldn't have washed. But nowadays we have I'd say we have 20 or 30% of people who'll fall for anything safety related, literally like sheep. I don't like that comparison. It's nasty, but it's true. And we have another 40 or 50 or 60% of people beyond that who will keep their head down and not complain when absurd things are pushed on us or foisted on us in the name of safety. And we saw this during the viral issue.
Sure. Well, see, one of the things that doesn't get discussed, because it's an extremely touchy subject. You see, in this country, we have topics that are very touchy, meaning nobody wants to go near them because they'll cause so much trouble. And I'm going to give you an example. 72% of the United States right now are overweight or obese. That number is going to continue to go up at the present rate, if you don't mind the pun, of expansion. We're going to be at 87% of the American public will be overweight or obese by the year 2030, according to my actuarial colleagues. Now, it's not being discussed at a local or a national level in a manner that makes any sense. And the reason is, when you compare people who are overweight or obese, which is a kind of impulse control disorder, you're not controlling your impulses. That's part of the issue. To other impulse control disorders, such as drugs, alcohol, gambling, you can hide all those. I've treated heroin addicts that nobody knew they were a heroin addict, but you can hide it. You can hide alcoholism to a certain extent. But when you're overweight or obese, you're walking around showing it all the time. So there's a lot of shaming and feeling guilty and bad and bullying, and it makes the topic extremely difficult to talk about. And so we're not. Now, another topic related to that I think is critical to your work, Ivor, is that 20% of the United States are illiterate. That's a huge number. That's 66 million people at least are illiterate. And to make it even more serious, roughly, we don't know the numbers for sure, because as you point out and lead the way, we need to be skeptical of even all the numbers, but we're told that roughly 50% of the United States read at a 5th grade level. Ivor, I cannot underline in red enough what that means in terms of what you and I are talking about, in terms of being skeptical, speaking truth to power, staying awake. Because when you've got half the population that can hardly read, how are we to get across to them the dangers to their lives, to their freedom, that all this so-called security and safety is going to bring them? How are we going to get them to be other than following the flock, without using the word that you didn't want to use? How do we get across to this group who don't listen to your YouTubes because they're so far in outer space to them, and yet everything you're saying and what you're discovering and what you're sharing is just as relevant to them as it is to you and me?
Yeah, I mean, Richard, that's the perennial question, and it comes. I do public talks in the UK and elsewhere, and the only thing I can come up with on that one, we're not going to get what I call the puppeticians that we have now. I mean, the politicians, they all report up to the UN, the EU Commission, or in America, some people say deep state. There's always higher orders of much smarter people, well organized, who are managing the world. It's just the way it is. You're not really going to have much luck with puppeticians, because most of those in the last 30, 40 years are venal, they're egotistical, they're after stuff for themselves, for all their fancy words. You're not going to get much traction trying to work with your politician. So I always say it's a two-hander. We each do what we can to change the world as an individual. The first thing is to share the message of truth, as in what's true, and obviously on nutrition and COVID and many other things. I've been trying to do that with a reasonably big platform. But an individual can do it as well, just with people they know and their smaller circle. What the bad guys use is propaganda and censorship. And we need to bring the truth back by sharing truth insofar as anywhere we can. And also opposing censorship wherever we can. But the other side, or the other hand, is to live the correct way. So if they want you in a 15-minute city, then don't, live more self-sufficient. If they want you to eat, ultra-processed junk food from a corporate pipeline shipped around the world, then insofar as you can, buy locally from farmers and support them. You know, use cash. They would like cash to get less and less popular, and everyone can go with their little card, or they can now pull out their phone. Oh, isn't it so convenient? But that's the dangerous road to universal central bank digital currency, which will be an absolute disaster because it will be a tool of censorship beyond anything we have ever seen. Imagine you're speaking up and your card doesn't work. You can't even go to your bank because they say, well, we didn't stop your card. It goes back to Big Brother at the central bank. You know, so use cash as much as possible. It will make it more difficult to transition. And
Ivor, I'm going to interrupt you. From my perspective, this is the most important thing you've taught us today. And you gave the reason. Use cash, because if you continue to use these other methods, they can be cut off in a second, and you can't cut off if you have a pile of cash in your house. I thank you very much for that. That's an important piece of information. Now, I want to get back. I asked you for 5 things that are being lied, that we're being lied to, that are the most dangerous. Number 1, nutrition. Number 2, the climate. Let's go on with 3, 4, and 5, please.
Oh, right. So how will I
Cash.
categorize it?
Oh, well, the cash and the credit card may be a big one.
That's a huge one, yeah. CBDC, the lie of CBDC. I interviewed Professor Richard Werner, who essentially invented and published the quantitative easing concepts that Bernanke got a Nobel Prize for.
Yeah.
Well, Professor Werner is amazing. And as he said, CBDC, they say it's all about digital and convenience. But we've had BDC, bank digital currency, for decades. So what's new about CBDC? Only one thing. The C, central, centralized. So think Politburo, think Soviet system, think EU Commission unelected. You know, back rooms, no one knows. It's centralized, where you can never touch, you can never respond. So like you say, if you're cancelled, you don't even know where to go. Centralized. So that's definitely a huge one that's coming down the track. Another big one, I guess the pandemic industry. Now, we've been through the big one in the last few years, but the danger of more. That whole thing is a lie. So they said, oh, it's the biggest pandemic since the Spanish flu, once in a century, right? But when you look at the data, there are prior flu years, without question, that have similar excess mortality to COVID. So it's a lie in our faces. I'll just give one other.
We have similar ones that have killed over 1 million people?
Oh, yeah. And that's back when they weren't even counting. So I'll tell you a famous graph. And I shared this until I got kicked off LinkedIn for sharing it. All it was it showed Sweden. Sweden did no lockdown, no masks, and they kept the kids up to 16 in school. Okay, so they didn't do any real measures at all. Anyone who says they kind of did, it's actually a lie. So they're a great country to look at because they were unprotected or less protected by a mile. When you look at the monthly deaths, they only had one big spike in the whole pandemic. It was April 2020. And you can see the spike. But why am I showing a tiny spike? Because on the graph of mortality monthly from the Swedish government going back 100 years, you've got a big spike in 1918. In the 1800s, you have a huge spike. People ask, what's that? It was the cholera epidemic. So the prior epidemics were based on hygiene, nutrition, lots of other problems that are gone now. And then you look and you clearly see in the last 30 years, at least 2, if not 3, bigger mortality spikes in winter than COVID. And that's a country that has a very aged demographic, right, which means they're going to experience the worst possible hit. And it's government data, and excess mortality is the only thing you can judge. And there you have it on one graph. And that's why I got kicked off LinkedIn and some other platforms, because people just couldn't handle that fully factual graph. So I could go through the data all day, but the fact of the matter is, prior flu seasons, was it 58 and, the other flus, no one was really counting because there was no pandemic industry or pandemic industrial complex. And the prior ones were not trigger events for, well, what we've seen in the last few years, the rise of totalitarianism.
This is the first thing you've said that I haven't been able to follow, because I'm 85 years old and I've lived long enough to watch 80 years or 85 years of pandemics. I don't recall anything even close to this recent pandemic that happened in my lifetime. I don't, and we had the polio scare, but it didn't take vast numbers of people. I don't know what you're referring to, when you seem to be saying that there were other events, but they didn't get treated this way. I don't know what other events you're referring to.
Well, 1958 flu, there was one in the 60s. If you look, I'm going by the data of excess mortality.
Yes, you've
broadly.
got to. Please send me that. Will you send me that graph that you got knocked off LinkedIn for? Yeah,
absolutely.
And send me the data on the 58 and 60. So you're listing up the pandemic industry, and I understand that because of the vast amounts of money made. And let's move on to your next most dangerous thing. The big lie. The big lie.
The big lie. Well, I would say the framing of Russia and Putin for the last decade or two as the big aggressive enemy and the Hitler and all that kind of stuff. So I interviewed Alex Craner, who's a hedge fund manager in Monaco, and he spent the last 4 years deeply studying over 100 years of Russia and the West relationships. And the reason he started studying and published a book on this was he was hearing within the hedge fund community, this is many years ago, like 17, 18, they were gunning for a war with Russia. The word was out. We need to have a war with Russia. We need to topple Russia. A bit like America has toppled countless countries since World War II.
Yes.
And he realized that was really dangerous. So he began to explore it. But I think that is a huge, Putin is a tough man. Of course he is. He's got 150 million people. He needs to stay running that country. He hasn't done anything that even the CIA and all the other apparatus of the USA has done. It's no big deal in the world of managing huge countries. It's tough business.
You mean
but we are told, the lie that it's all Orange man bad or Putin man bad. Ukraine is an extremely dangerous flashpoint. They're gunning for World War III, even in the media. Like today, just this afternoon, Russia supposedly sent a flare or a missile at a German reconnaissance plane. And they're talking in the media about World War III. Like, how dangerous is this? How insane is it? But the reality is, 2014, I think Oliver Stone made a film about this. The West, primarily the State Department, I guess, and its agents, they got the coup in 2014 in Ukraine to get a pro-Russian president who was democratically elected out and then to put in a puppet. And here we are. So again, it's a complex scenario, but the reality is NATO and the USA and the West in general is crushing in on Russia's borders, bringing NATO right up into their backyard. And eventually something has to give.
Yeah.
But the lie in the West is, oh, it's Hitler. Oh, he's going to invade Europe. This stuff is insane. It's a lie beyond belief.
Well, I'm sure you remember what happened to Galileo.
Indeed.
And a lot of people were very surprised when it turned out that the earth was round and you didn't fall off the edge.
Well, this is it. But, it occurs to me, just to drop in there, if we just for COVID for a moment think of the absurdity of the lie. In the middle of the summer, you remember we were told not to wear masks in March or April. Masks no good at the start in 2020.
Yeah.
And then in the summer, suddenly, precisely when the seasonal virus had lost all activity, the ICUs were empty, there weren't even PCR positives to play with and scare people with. We were literally in the doldrums. And I told an Irish doctors group I was working with, COVID Recovery Ireland, I said, guys, art of war. We own the terrain now until next October, November, when the virus ignites again. You know, it's a winter thing. We know that. So we own the terrain. But you know what happened? All across Europe and America, in the middle of the summer, when nothing was happening, they turned around and brought in mask mandates with prison sentences and fines across all European countries like that. And no one stood up and said, hold on a minute, whatever about the masks you told us not to wear, and now you're saying they're good, and you pull that out of your ass, by the way, but that's a separate topic. You're telling us to put masks in our faces unilaterally in the middle of the summer when all the hospitals are empty. And it worked. I mean, the size of the lies is astonishing.
Let's go down this particular rabbit hole together on the masks. But you're a scientist. Now, you know very well that filters work. Filters filter things out. And their ability to filter things out is related to the nature of the filter and the size of the molecule that you're attempting to filter. Therefore, it would follow, or it should follow, that if you create a mask or a filter that is capable of stopping molecules the size of the COVID molecule, you will stop them from going through the filter in either direction. Do you agree?
That's called mechanistic reasoning. Theoretically, what you said, but the virons are vastly smaller than the filtration on the masks they told us to wear. I mean,
okay, now
vastly smaller.
You may be right that the masks they told us to wear were not effective because they weren't built properly. But wouldn't you agree that you could build a mask that would stop the COVID molecule?
Absolutely. It's the mask you would use in a class 3 or class 4 biohazard lab.
Thank you.
But it would be a suit and a glass full helmet with HEPA filters. Yeah, you could.
Okay, so I'll tell you where I'm going.
Yeah.
I interviewed the physicists at Duke University that did the famous mask study where they took 19 or 20 different kinds of filters and they pushed molecules the size of the COVID molecule through, and they measured on the other side to see which material was the most effective in stopping the molecular transmission. And I also interviewed the Scandinavians who did a very large study on the masks. So you probably have heard about them. And I invited our friend Creon. I invited Creon Levitt onto my program so he would be present during the interview. I thought it would make it more interesting. Now, the physicists at Duke said that there were certain materials that were definitely able to stop more molecules than others. In other words, there was the number one stopper and the number two, et cetera, et cetera. So the question then is, why do you think we were not able to come up with a filter that fit on a person's face short of the big apparatus that you described which I'm familiar with, why were we not able to simply come up with something that a person could put on their face and stop the molecular transmission? And why were we sold this nonsense and people are wearing bandanas and they're wearing and they're everything imaginable that was ridiculous, including wearing things that, according to the physicist, actually facilitated transmission.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, there's a simple answer, actually. So the mechanistic is all very well, but the problem is I was in the complex problem-solving world as a system integrator, an engineer. The academics and the researchers, you can do mechanistic studies in the lab, and I actually fell for the mask nonsense in April 2020, and I was promoting them. People never let me forget, because I saw a documentary from Japan going through exactly what you said, and I was impressed at a surface level. And then I found out later when I dug into it, there have been countless randomized control trials of masks for influenza transmission, and the ultimate real-world effect, even with good ones like N95s, is no signal. And then I read Dr. Hope Simpson's The Transmission of Epidemic Influenza. He spent 50 years, a doctor in England, working on the astonishing, bizarre question of how does influenza and coronavirus transmits. And it turned out to be vastly more complex than anyone had realized. And that's a whole story in itself. But I could go on and on. The real world effect of masks dramatically in the first month of using them. Dramatically, there was no signal. North Dakota, South Dakota, similar people, similar numbers, lockdown masks, no lockdown, no masks, largely. Superimposed curves. You could look all over the world at mask versus no mask. In real world, it did nothing. Now, you asked the question, what could you make? Well, generally, you need something very exotic. It needs to be face sealed. I did asbestos removal when I was 19 in upstate New York. And we had to go and dance in a smoke chamber, acrid smoke, to make sure our mask fitted. You had to shave tight. The complexity of doing it, and then you need a membrane, and if it's capable of stopping that level, it's a big deal. You will have a problem with throughput unless you have a huge surface area. So you have people going around again in these huge, it's impossible. But the simple answer, it was never about the science. When in the middle of the summer, when the hospitals were empty, the PCR was right down, no one was dying, and the whole thing was basically non-existent in the summer all across Europe. They brought in mandatory face rags with prison sentences and fines all across Europe, every country in lockstep. So you don't need to be a master detective to say that's 100% political or agenda. It cannot be scientific, and it cannot be safety. It's impossible.
With one exception, with one possible exception, Ivor.
Okay.
If I have something communicable, if I hold this up, do I somewhat, in a measurable way, decrease the amount of molecules that I'm expressing? It may not be perfect. It may not be 80%, but do I decrease at all when I have this? Or are you going to make the case that I'm not decreasing at all?
In terms of influenza or coronavirus transmission, you can never say not never, as you said at the start of this interview. So little, it has no meaning in the real world. That's the way I'd put it.
In other words, so many of the molecules are going to get in around the sides and underneath and over the top, and a few are going to go through that when you compare it to nothing at all, there's no J and D.
Indistinguishable.
No J and D. No J and just noticeable difference. No
way. And we know that from 1,000 comparative analyses around the world. We know that for a fact, so I'm comfortable saying it, because you look at X versus no X across 1,000 pairs of jurisdictions, and always the curves are superimposed. That's it. It's over. So the question is answered. But the other thing is, if you take an N95 even, or a better form of mask, and suck in a vape, you know, the vape devices,
I've
and
had some
breathe out
familiarity
normally.
with vapes.
Yeah. These are spread apparently from aerosols, micro droplets. Vape is an aerosol. Take a pull on a vape, put your mask on quickly, breathe out normally, and your head will be engulfed in a cloud. That's it. Case closed.
Well, I understand what you're saying. I've had the same discussion with Creon about, that there's so much in the atmosphere that if the thing isn't sealed, and I do understand that.
Yeah.
And so then the question arises for some of us. What was the motivation? Was it to sell masks and help the mask industry? No.
No.
What was the
No.
motivation to push us into mask? Was it social control? Was it to show that we're doing something? Was it psychological? Why do that? And why do it in such a draconian way?
Okay, I'll parse that out. The reason it was done was the inverse of what I told my medical colleagues. I said, there is no way they can start this pandemic nonsense next October, November. It'll be too late. Because I said in the next few months, people are going to move on from this. And we know that the excess mortality shows a bad flu-like impact all across Europe. We have all the numbers. People are going to go a few months of the summer. They're going to forget about this. You ain't going to bring them back to drink this water. So I was so positive. They knew that. So the whole COVID thing and the hysteria, clear as crystal from April or May, was for the magic cure, the warp speed cure, whatever, which duly arrived right on time. We said by the end of the year, they're going to bypass all trials, all safety long-term, and there's going to be a magic sauce. And there was. That whole thing was going to collapse. The whole thing was going to collapse. And it was a stroke of genius. And when I saw the mandatory masks coming out, by the way, the reason they have prison sentences and fines is the same thing. They know what I know. That there's no way, if you recommend masks in the middle of the summer when the hospitals are empty and nothing's happening, there's no way you're going to get mask compliance. That's why they came in with prison sentences and fines, simultaneous. They're not stupid. So it was basically have the whole COVID thing be worthless after all that preparation and effort. Or you had to find something to keep people psychologically in pandemia through that long, dry summer. And gotta hand it to them, they pulled it off.
They pulled it off. Of the various things you've said that are dangerous, the two I would like to come back to, and we won't have time today, but maybe we could at another interview, are nutrition and using cash. Those two things look like we can make some inroads. It's too late to do anything about this pandemic. I'm not certain that we can do anything about the controversy about the climate, because it's maybe
Tough.
we can. It's very tough, but I do believe that we can make some serious inroads on nutrition and on this, what you're suggesting, that we use cash instead of the cards. And I would like to discuss with you tactics. I'm all about getting jobs done and in a practical way and fixing things, not just being theoretical. And I'd like to talk about what we can do to foster the use of cash. I think it's absolutely a wonderful idea in terms of marshaling a fight against this central control of the economy, which that alone that you brought to my attention about being able anywhere in the world to stop all of my finance with the push of a button, that is ultimate control. That is ultimate control. And I want to get on the team to be able to do something about that one. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, the beauty of that one is it's quite simple. Just insist on cash and push the envelope. So
yeah, we have to get we need to get tens of millions of people being willing to be inconvenienced by cash, because now they've created a situation of convenience where you don't even have to use your credit card now. Now I walk into a store and I take my phone and I touch my phone to a device and I paid my bill.
I know. The problem is, I mean, a wolf in sheep's clothing, it is really convenient. And I admit myself, ordering things on the internet, I work very hard on all of what I do, and ordering stuff on the internet and using cards, it is convenient. No denying that.
Extremely.
So what I do is, and my wife as well, we have, a big family. What we do is we keep taking out cash, keep cash in our pockets and our wallets, encourage the 5 kids to do the same, work with cash with them, use cash for the stuff where cash is still fine, especially the supermarket. And when I'm buying things in builders providers, because I do some renovation projects on the side, use cash in the builders. So it's not to be extremist, but keep it alive by using it in as much as it's practical. But I still got to order stuff on the internet, and occasionally I need to use a card for my audited accounts for the revenue, because they sent a bailiff after me once because I was speaking out against the government. That's a long story. I'll tell you next time.
Okay.
But I had a fine. Yeah, it was crazy stuff. Insane. So sometimes I need to use the card. But you don't need to use cash for everything obsessively, because all you're doing is making sure you keep it alive. So if you use it for half the stuff. Now, Europe, and I think America, it's happening as well, particularly Europe, they've kind of made it, I believe, that you can't have more than 10,000 in cash. It used to be on an airplane, but now it's generally. And they want to bring it down to 5,000, and I think then 2,000.
Are you talking about you're not allowed to have more than that in your personal home safe?
Well, technically they don't say...
They don't want you to travel with more than that. Traveling, but I don't know about having it at home. We have to find out more about that.
Not at home. So they're quite clever. They're not going to do something that gets risky with constitutions. Transactions.
Yes.
So you can't have a transaction.
That's right. Yes.
Anywhere.
And also in this country, Ivor, if you try to cash a check over a certain amount at our local bank, they have to report it. And if you bring in a certain amount of cash and deposit it, they will report it. I learned that from my local bank. Ivo, we're running out of time here. I'm going to have to conclude this. It's been I'm so sorry. It's been a privilege talking to you, and I hope you'll be willing to do it again.
Absolutely, Richard, anytime, because the beauty of these things, just like for yourself, there's no preparation per se, and it's just so easy to hop on, and hopefully people find it entertaining and informative. Great stuff.
Okay, I'm going to have Charlie contact you, and we'll do it again. So thank you very much. It's really been great having you here. And thank you all, general listeners, for being with us with this exciting program today with Ivor Cummins on Mind, Body, Health, and Politics. I remind you, we come out with a new show every week. They're on the archives. For those of you who don't realize it, all my archives for the last 20 years are open source. They're free. You go there, mindbodyhealthpolitics.org, and you can listen to the great minds having interesting discussions. Until next time, this is Dr. Richard Lewis Miller reminding you that good health is worth fighting for, and it's essential for life liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
All